In September of 2012, Phil Mickelson is about to represent the United States in one of the biggest golf tournaments of the year. And as an entire nation is sitting there waiting to watch Phil play, he stops, steps away, and with his hands literally shaking, calls Billy Walters his bookie and asks to place a $400,000 bet on his own team to win. Now, this wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a symptom of a much larger disease that had been growing for over 30 years. So how did everyone's favorite golfer go from mastering the hardest game on earth to drowning in debt and chasing an emotional high that he couldn't control, literally jeopardizing his whole career? And what happened when Phil's gambling problem led to an illegal $1 million insider trading accusation? And how did he fix it all? By selling out to oil tycoons. This right here is the story of how Phil Mickelson gambled away $1 billion and paid the price of being the most expensive addiction in history. Now let's back up a bit, because Phil Mickelson, he had basically mastered the game of golf at this point. He did so with precision and grace, and he was extremely likable. I mean, who didn't like Lefty, right? And to this point, he had won 42 PGA Tour events, 3 Masters tournaments, and was the second highest earner in golf history, behind only, well, you guessed it, Tiger Woods. But Phil, he had a problem. His financial life and freedom was falling apart around him. So how did he get here? Well, let me introduce you to Billy Walters. Now, if you don't know who Billy is, just know this: he considers himself to be the Michael Jordan of sports betting. And honestly, he's not far off. The guy is considered one of the most successful American sports bettors in history, making hundreds of millions of dollars from gambling. In many ways, Phil and Billy are mirrors of each other because they are both obsessed with taking risks. But Billy, well, he was a different kind of guy. He struggled with major issues linked to alcoholism and losing every penny to his name on multiple occasions before he eventually was able to curb his personal addictions to be successful. At the end of the day, he still was a gambling bookie. So when he met Phil Mickelson, let's just say what happened next would change both of their lives forever, and not in a good way. You see, Phil became Billy's biggest whale, meaning that Phil would wager enormous amounts of money and Billy didn't question it because from his point of view, Phil could afford it. But check this out. According to Walter's book, it's called Gambler: Secrets from a Life of Risk, Phil placed 1,115 bets of $110,000 each, and another 858 bets of $220,000 each. In 2011 alone, Phil made over 3,000 bets of varying amounts. In fact, Billy talks about one day in June of 2011 where he made 43 bets on Major League Baseball games just for Phil. 43 in one day. I mean, I can't even name 43 baseball players, but Phil, he was betting on them like his life depended on it. Now, while I was doing some research, a recurring question kept popping up in my head, and probably you too. Phil is rich and he can afford it, right? Well, that's true. Phil had millions rolling in from endorsements and playing on the PGA, but here's where things get really interesting because obviously the money wasn't filling the void. Winning at golf, it's great, but it's kind of slow. I don't know many people who can sit through an entire 4-day golf tournament just watching it on TV, right? And on the course, Phil, well, he was a risk taker. In fact, he thrives on it.
I love to take on risk.
He needed that extra oomph, for a challenge. And as a fierce competitor, that's actually a great mentality to have. But when it bleeds over outside of golf, well, that's where problems start to arise. Now, Phil couldn't just walk into any random Vegas sports book without making headlines and being plastered all over the news. So that's why he used Billy. Billy had connections to bookmakers everywhere. So Phil put up the money, Billy placed the bets, and they split the profits. It was a perfect combination to feed each other's addiction. But the question still remains, why does a man with a private jet, a loving wife, and trophies on his shelf risk it all? My guess is that Phil needed to manufacture that Sunday at the Masters pressure on a random Thursday at the XYZ tournament, and he needed to do that just to feel normal. Like a drug addict chasing a high that was getting harder and harder to catch, that had to be how Phil felt. But what happens when you can't achieve that high again? Well, that's when the action starts to bleed over into other places that it really didn't need to be going, and that was straight into the stock market. So this is where the story shifts from being a fun sports betting on the side to something a little darker. You see, betting on baseball, that's one thing. You win, you lose, you move on, right? But when you are in a hole as deep as Phil was, you stop looking at just fair bets. You start looking at more sure things. And in the world of high finance, a sure thing usually means breaking the law. And this is where we are introduced to this company, Dean Foods. Now, this scandal was the moment that everything almost came crashing down. And hold on, it gets a little wild. So here's the setup. You have this guy, his name was Tom Davis. He was a board member for Dean Foods, which at the time was one of the biggest producers of milk in the United States. Now, here's the connection. Tom was also a gambler, and he was in debt to you know who, Billy Walters. Now, when you owe a guy like Billy Walters money and you cannot or you will not pay the debt, that debt doesn't just disappear. You see, Billy is a bookie, so they had to have a pretty tough conversation, and there was a negotiation that they came down to. And in this case, it was something else. It was an opportunity. So Tom fed Billy secret information about Dean Foods, and as a board member, Tom knew exactly when the stock would jump. So he told Billy when to invest and when to get out. Now, Billy, in an underhanded effort to get the money that he's owed, controls the narrative a little bit here and tells Phil to buy Dean Foods. Now, I want you to pause because Phil, he's a smart guy. He's not a dummy, right? And when a professional gambler tells you to dump millions of dollars into a random dairy company, you know he's not doing it because he just likes the milk, right? You have to know that that is inside information, which, by the way, is very, very illegal. Just ask Mark the Steward. But Phil had a problem. Even though he and Tom didn't know each other personally, they shared something even more unnerving. They both owed Billy Walters money. So what did they do? Well, Phil, he took the bait and he didn't waste any time. And one of the most controlled and scientific guys on the golf course allowed desperation to override his reason and executed an illegal stock trade. So he bought $2.4 million worth of Dean Foods stock. And guess what? The stock jumped and Phil pocketed $931,000 and immediately wired that money to Billy to pay off the gambling debts. Now, think about the desperation in that move. Phil knows that this is insider trading and that it is a federal crime. And he had to have known what happened to Martha Stewart because she went to prison for much less. But the debt that he owed Billy must have felt like a loaded gun onto his head, something that needed fixing immediately, while the SEC felt like a problem for future Phil to have to deal with, right? Well, of course, you know who came a-knocking after a while. The feds. And after the investigations, Phil got lucky, and I mean extremely lucky. He was named what's called a relief defendant, and this is a fancy legal term that basically means that we're not going to charge you with a crime, but you are holding stolen money and we want it back. So Phil had to pay back that $931,000 plus interest. Now, thankfully, his lapse in judgment didn't require him to be walked away in handcuffs. And I don't know about you, but I get nervous when my mom asks me for my Netflix password. So that's enough to scare me straight, but not Phil. You'd think that the entire federal government coming after you should have been the scare of a lifetime, right? But when you are an addict, you don't hear the warning. You just see that you got away with it. And this brings us to really Phil's superpower, which can also be his greatest curse: compartmentalization. Now, while all of the legal chaos was swirling in the background, don't forget Phil was still actively playing golf and even won the Open Championship in 2013 while all of this was going on. So Phil was playing some of the best golf of his life, and he literally was sinking 10-foot putts to win majors while the FBI was going through his bank records. And I think I understand it now, all right, personally. For Phil, the golf course was another place where the noise stopped. He could shut out the chaos of his life and just be lefty again, right? But off the course, Phil didn't stop. He continued to make uncalculated and unnecessary risks off the course. Now, the gambling addiction, it escalated to something that got even crazier, and it pushed him toward a line that no athlete should ever cross: a betrayal that went deeper than just money. Now, if there is one event in golf that matters more than money, it's definitely the Ryder Cup, which is a golf competition between the United States and Europe. And at that 39th Ryder Cup, Phil Mickelson was the leader of Team USA. But while the camera saw a patriot ready to fight for his country, the addiction, that gambling addiction, it saw an opportunity. And according to Billy Walters' book, Phil, he stepped away from the team room, away from all of his teammates, and with his hands probably shaking and his heart racing, he picks up his phone and he calls his bookie, Billy Walters, and he had something to ask. Something that would cross a line that he could never uncross. Something that, if it got out, would destroy everything that Phil has built up to this point. But he asked it anyway. He wanted to place a $400,000 bet on the US team to win the Ryder Cup. Now, let that sink in. He wanted to bet nearly $500,000 on a tournament that he himself was playing in. Now, we can only speculate as to what was going through his head in that one moment, because no rational person does this. One of the most calculated and forward-thinking men in golf wasn't thinking at all. And at this point, Phil had become a man who had completely lost the ability to see the edge of the cliff. He risked his personal and professional careers just to feel a little bit more engaged in the match that he was playing in. But here's where things take an unexpected twist, because the voice of reason, the moral compass who stepped in to save Phil, was Billy Walters, a professional gambler, a man who would later go on to prison. He was the one who told Phil no. In fact, Billy replied, "Have you lost your bleeping mind? Don't you remember what happened to Pete Rose? You represent the modern day Arnold Palmer. You'd risk all of that for this? I want no part of it." Which is pretty crazy, right? I mean, he saved Phil from immediately destroying his career, and he refused the bet. Now, even though the bet itself didn't happen, that's not the tragedy. The tragedy here is that Phil asked to do this. It showed that the lefty mask had completely slipped off of Phil's face. He was willing to risk his entire legacy, his place in the Hall of Fame, and his reputation as the golden boy of golf just for the risk. Billy went on to allege that over 3 decades, Phil Mickelson wagered more than $1 billion. So to put that into perspective, if you made $100,000 a year from your job, it would take you 10,000 years to earn what Phil just gambled away. And it's important to note that Phil didn't win every bet. His losses were estimated to be around $100 million. So yeah, the house, it always wins. But through all of the financial losses, Phil admitted that he lost something that was worth way more than money. Because Phil didn't lose his house, he didn't really lose his career, but he lost something that's even harder to replace: a decade of being present with his family. Phil's gambling addiction caused him to be physically present, but mentally absent with his family. He was at his daughter's soccer game, but thinking about the football spread. He was at dinner, but checking the scores on his phone. And his wife, Amy, even told him, "You're here, but you're not with us." Those words haunted him for years, because she was right. He had everything: money, fame, talent, but he was missing his own life. And it's easy to see why, because look at where he was. He had dodged a bullet with the SEC, he had been saved from a Pete Rose-like bet by a criminal, and the betting losses were piling up fast, and he kept digging into a deeper and deeper hole. So Phil needed an escape. Not from poverty, but from the noises that was in his head. The addiction had grown from a vice into his entire identity, and he was about to make a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of almost every professional golfer on the tour. For 10 years, Phil fought his addiction and tried to hide it. He won tournaments, he made millions, he even went to therapy, but the addiction wouldn't stop. By 2022, it had completely consumed him, and he needed an escape. And that's when a new player kind of came out of nowhere. Billionaire oil tycoons from Saudi Arabia who started LIV Golf, a direct competitor to the PGA Tour. Now imagine going into a candy store to buy one bar of chocolate. Then someone with more money walks in and buys the entire store. That's LIV Golf. They didn't just compete with the PGA Tour, they were attempting to dismantle it. They came through poaching players from the PGA to play exclusively for them. And Phil was one of those players, and they poached him for a cool $200 million. The media painted this move as pure greed, and everyone had a theory. More prevailing ones was that he just needed the cash, or he was just chasing one more big payday before he calls it quits and retires. But that wasn't true. Phil wasn't hurting for money because he had been doing okay on the PGA Tour for years after all of the gambling issues and the federal scrutiny. So the real question was, what was Phil running from? Phil joined LIV Golf because he was broken. For 6 years, he had been floating, dealing with therapy, repairing his image, and hiding the shame. But LIV offered a fresh start, a place to be reborn. And even if it meant that Phil had to burn every bridge that he ever built, he was going to do it to get that fresh start. So once he joined LIV Golf, sponsors like KPMG, Workday, and Amstel Light dropped him instantly. And the PGA Tour eventually came down on him and suspended him. Fans felt betrayed because for the first time, the world saw Phil not as the lovable lefty, but as a desperate man scrambling for an exit. We often assume that because someone is a genius in one area, like hitting a golf ball, they must be wise in everything else, but that's simply not true. Strength in one area doesn't necessarily protect you from being weak in another. In fact, the ego that makes you great at sports, like the belief that you can pull off that risky and impossible shot, is probably the exact thing that destroys you when you apply it to gambling. Phil, he went dark, disappearing from the public eye, but when he came back, he looked different, he sounded different, and in summer of 2023, he finally posted that long, vulnerable message on social media, and he admitted that his gambling had crossed the line into addiction. He said that, "My gambling got to a point of being reckless and embarrassing. I had to address it, and I've been addressing it for a number of years, and with hundreds of hours of therapy, I feel good where I'm at." What's important here is that Phil eventually did get help. Now, he shows up for his family both physically and mentally. His kids finally have a dad who's actually present, not just sitting at the dinner table, but listening, not just at the game, but actually watching the game. And this is where we have to see the human being, not the villain, because recovery is terrifying and it has its setbacks. But for 30 years, Phil lived with the constant noise of the next bet, the next risky and high stakes score, that next dopamine hit. But at least now, he can be present with those closest to him, his family. Phil has seemingly found peace, and I sure hope so, because this whole ordeal is a tragedy. And here's what kills me about Phil's story. He mastered the golf course. He hit impossible shots under a tremendous amount of pressure. But off the golf course, he lost control. And that's the real lesson here, because we're all like Phil in some way. We're all good at something, but we're all struggling with something else. The question is, will you master both, or will you let one destroy the other. Now, one of the biggest players in this entire story was LIV Golf. And if you want to see how they are secretly destroying golf one player at a time, I want you to check out this video right here and let me know where you stand on this topic in the comments. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video.